All right, Block 9, Blacks in the Civil War. There's no getting around and denying the fact that the Civil War was fought over slavery. Slavery was the reason the Union divided and split up. Slavery was the thing that fundamentally set apart the Confederate South from the rest of the country. And although the war is not fought at first to end slavery, it eventually will be fought to end slavery, and it's certainly important that we have a good look at what President Lincoln's view on slavery and race and abolition and all those sorts of things were, and then how that affected the over 4 million blacks living in the United States in 1860, most of them slaves, and what happened to them throughout the course of this war that eventually did bring them their freedom and an end to the slavery that they had been suffering for hundreds of years and for many generations. Let's start, as most things in the Civil War should start, by having a look at President Lincoln and his views on race and slavery. From the time he was a young man, Lincoln was anti-slavery. He did not like slavery. He famously said that if slavery was not evil, then nothing was evil. But like most whites, the vast majority of whites at the time, Lincoln also did not believe in racial equality. He did not think that the average black man was equal in talents, abilities, intelligence, etc. to the average white man. That did not believe that Lincoln believed in slavery or believed in treating blacks with anything besides life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He believed that blacks ought to live, as he said, quote, to live in freedom and to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow. That just like any other American, blacks should be able to work hard, make money, and support and raise their families. During the debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858, Lincoln very specifically came out and said that black Americans were entitled to the guarantees of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He did not, however, believe until late in his life that blacks ought to be full citizens with political rights like the right to voting until much later in his life. Despite the fact that Lincoln was anti-slavery, that did not, this is so important, he was not an abolitionist. He did not believe that it was possible to immediately emancipate all the slaves of the South at once. He did not run for president as an abolitionist. An abolitionist, by definition, wishes to abolish slavery here and now. Lincoln did not, he did not think he had the right to do that when he ran for president. He was not an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. He did, however, base his entire presidential campaign and his entire success in pursuing the presidency, and he based one of his most strongly held political beliefs was that the spread of slavery ought to be stopped. He did not like slavery, did not want to see it expand, but he did not feel he had the authority to free the slaves. Okay, so number 3, C3, as president, at first, he did not believe that his position as president gave him the authority to free the slaves. Nowhere in the Constitution, Lincoln read his Constitution, it does not say the president may free the slaves if he wants to. And Lincoln made it clear, this is important also, in the first part of the Civil War, Lincoln makes it very clear that the Civil War was not a war about slavery. Secession might have been about slavery, but Lincoln's response to secession was all about unionism, was all about bringing the Union back together. And he famously wrote in a letter to the newspaper editor Horace Greeley in New York, quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would also do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." It is very clear from that statement that Lincoln's primary goal in the early part of the Civil War was to save the Union. And if the seceded states had come back, they would have come back with the institution of slavery intact. But as the Civil War progressed, and it got bloodier and more expensive and more costly in human lives, Lincoln's views began to change. He started to meet more than once with the great black leader Frederick Douglass, and Douglass sort of, in his very presence, almost taught Lincoln racial equality in a sense. Douglass said of Lincoln in his company, "I was never reminded of my humble origins or my unpopular color." As the war continues, by 1864, Lincoln believes he supports a constitutional amendment to outlaw slavery. And number 3, as he got even older and the war progressed to its end, 3 days before he died, he gave a speech arguing in favor of voting rights for those blacks who he called intelligent, or those who served in the Union armies. So you cannot pin Lincoln down. This is what Abraham Lincoln believed about race. It changed and altered and was different at different points in his life. And that's the thing to remember. So if you're ever asked to write an essay on Abraham Lincoln's views of race, your thesis statement has to be they were complex and ever-changing. And eventually, before he died, he believed that many blacks, at least, not only should have full civil rights, but political rights as well. Number 2, slavery, secession, and the Civil War. When Lincoln becomes president, or is elected president in 1860, as we know, the South began to secede, starting with South Carolina. By the time Lincoln became president, the Deep South had seceded, and there were a number of states that were promising to secede if Lincoln fired at Fort Sumter. But there was another group of states that Lincoln was even more concerned about. Let's have a look at those. They are known as the border states. Here they are. Okay. After Fort Sumter, all the states in red have seceded. The states in blue are the free states of the North, and the states in yellow, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, are slave states that did not secede. Lincoln needed these states in the Union. In terms of the war itself, those states were vital. And because he needs them, he has to be very careful with what he does about slavery. And very quickly, Lincoln promised those states that he would do nothing to interfere with the rights of property. And that obviously means slavery. Lincoln said to the governors of Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware, "I will not interfere with the rights of property in your states," and therefore, although they owned slaves, they stayed in the Union. In August of 1861, Jhansi Fremont, and we remember Fremont from the story of California. He was the first Republican to run for president. He's appointed military governor of Missouri. There's a lot of Civil War action going on in Missouri, almost guerrilla warfare on both sides, and Lincoln appoints Fremont as the military governor of the state. And in August of 1861, Fremont, an anti-slave person, an abolitionist, issues an executive order freeing all the slaves in Missouri. And he says, "My executive authority as governor gives me the right to do that." Well, in Missouri, in Kentucky, in Maryland, in Delaware, all hell breaks loose. These border states react violently, saying that no one has a right to unilaterally dictate the end to slavery, and they threaten to secede. And if Missouri and Kentucky and these border states were to secede, the military job of subduing the South would be that much harder. Lincoln is very angry at Fremont for acting without authorization and for jumping the gun, and he orders Fremont's orders revoked. And when Fremont refuses, Lincoln fires him and replaces him with someone who will actually listen to the president's orders. Throughout 1861 and 1862, several Union generals in the South along the coast, where the Union had kind of gotten little footholds in the Confederacy, these Union generals give protection to runaway slaves. And one of these generals even begins inducting slaves into the army. And Lincoln orders these actions stopped. Now, we need to understand something. Lincoln stops Fremont from freeing the slaves, and Lincoln stops his Union generals in the South from arming the slaves, not because he morally disagreed with them, but because he politically disagreed with them. He said, right now, this is not good politics. We need to keep the border states in the Union. We need to make sure that the North, which is not, all abolitionists, stays behind the war effort. So Lincoln is being careful politically. However, by the middle of 1862, as the war is growing more bloody, Lincoln began to understand that ending slavery would be necessary so that the nation would simply not repeat the mistakes and the problems that it had in its first 90 years of history. But Lincoln said the decision was going to be his. It's the president's call, not Fremont's call, not a general's call. If slavery is going to be ended with the stroke of a pen in the United States, the person who's going to be doing that signing is going to be the president himself. Lincoln takes a first step in June of 1862, and in ignoring the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, Congress outlaws and Lincoln signs a law outlawing slavery in any U.S. territory. So by the middle of 1862, slavery in the territories, that issue that was huge throughout the entire decade of the 1850s, was put to rest. Congress outlawed slavery in the territories. Let me go turn off the heat so that noise does not continue in your background. There we go. All right. And that, Lincoln's belief that slavery was wrong, and Lincoln's belief that the war had to end slavery, or the problems that bedeviled the country would just come back, led him, number 3, to the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's just deal with some vocabulary first. Emancipate means to free, and proclamation is like a statement. All right, so the Emancipation Proclamation is a statement of people being freed. By the middle of 1862, Lincoln had decided that the war required the ending of slavery, and there was only one person with the moral authority and the constitutional authority to do so. And Lincoln decides he is going to announce that slavery will be forever ended in the Confederacy. He has to wait, though. He has to wait for a Union victory. He does not want it to seem like a case of desperation. So as the Union is losing battles in 1862, Lincoln has this proclamation, but he has to sit on it, and he has to wait for a victory. That victory comes in September at the Battle of Antietam. It's not a great, overwhelming victory, but for Lincoln, it's good enough. And less than a week after the battle, on the 22nd of September, 1862, Lincoln promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in areas of rebellion would be forever free if the states did not return to the United States by the first of the year, 1863. All right, so let's break this down. After claiming for years that no president had the constitutional authority to end slavery, how did Lincoln get around that? On what authority did he pass the Emancipation Proclamation? He still has to follow the Constitution. He just can't do whatever he wants. Lincoln bases his decision bases his authority on the fact that he is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He uses his authority as commander-in-chief to emancipate the slaves. And his reasoning for this makes total sense. He argues that the slaves are important parts of the Southern economy, and that's absolutely true. The slaves are the one for the most part, growing a lot of the food, picking most of the cotton. During the Civil War, they're working in, little manufacturing shops to produce things. There's 4 million people in the South dedicated to helping the Confederate military effort, and those 4 million people are the slaves. Lincoln says, without slavery, the Southern economy will tank. So his first logical statement is that slaves are an important part of the Southern economy. That makes sense. Lincoln then goes on, logical part number 2. Lincoln says, if we weaken the Southern economy, that's a military act. Weakening the Southern economy is a military act, and that makes sense. The military needs lots of food and guns and weapons and supplies, and if you weaken the economy, it reduces those things. Then Lincoln argues that freeing the slaves would weaken the Southern economy. That's logically apparent. And he finally says, here's my authority to declare the slaves free. My authority as commander-in-chief allows me to weaken the Southern economy as a military measure, and to weaken the Southern economy, I can free the slaves. It makes perfect logical sense. If you want to weaken the Southern economy to help win the war, you free the slaves. Done. So, who does it free? Well, here's the problem. The Emancipation Proclamation does not outlaw slavery in the United States. It only is operative for, quote, areas still in rebellion. That means areas that the Union Army does not control. There's a lot of rejoicing amongst the slaves when they hear of this. And it comes through the rumor mill and word of mouth, and you know how rumors and information spread in any population. But for most slaves in the South, when Lincoln spoke those words, it meant very little. They were not free. Of some slaves, about 50,000, were freed as a result of Lincoln's population, but 50,000 out of 4 million is not a very big percentage. So the slaves, most of the slaves who were slaves were not freed immediately by the Emancipation Proclamation, but letter C, as Union armies advanced through the South, down the Mississippi River, through Tennessee, Sherman's March to the Sea, up through the Carolinas, as Union armies advanced through the South, thousands and then tens of thousands of slaves flocked to the Union Army to demonstrate their freedom. Yes, we're free, we're leaving our place of enslavement, and we are going to the Union Army. As soon as the Union Army took over a place in the South, the slaves that could get to the Union Army and areas where the Union Army was now in control were freed. Who did it not free? Well, it doesn't free a single slave in the border states. It does not free any slaves in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee had been returned to United States military control in 1862, and a Union military government had been set up. So in order to prevent an uprising in Tennessee, Tennessee was exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves in New Orleans are not freed, even though it's controlled by American troops for the same reason, and other areas on the southern coast as well. So the thing to remember about the Emancipation Proclamation and who it freed and who it didn't, it did not, for the most part, it freed nobody at the time it was written. But as the war went on and the Union armies became more and more successful, it freed tens and then hundreds of thousands of slaves. This is huge. This is redefining the war. The war now is about slavery and not Union. Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, says it very eloquently, but the fact was that the war became a war about slavery before the Gettysburg Address in the Emancipation Proclamation. Number 4. Many abolitionists are unhappy at this Emancipation Proclamation. They think it does not go far enough. But Lincoln had another goal in mind. And number 5, this is one of the main reasons for the Emancipation Proclamation, its effect on foreign affairs. It's a huge foreign affairs success. Now let's remember, one of the main things that the Confederacy wanted was recognition from Europe, from especially Britain and France. Their main foreign policy goal was to get British and French recognition of their country. That is, Britain and France saying, we recognize the Confederate States of America as an independent country. But both Great Britain and France are countries that oppose slavery. France had gotten rid of slavery during the French Revolution in the 1790s. Britain had gotten rid of slavery in the early 1800s, and then the British people turned against slavery. Britain was a big anti-slavery country. And as soon as Lincoln makes the war about slavery, the British and the French are going to have a really tough time supporting a Confederate States of America that stands, in most foreigners' eyes, for slavery. That the British government is going to have a really tough time saying, we're anti-slavery and we support the Confederacy. It doesn't make sense. And Lincoln, turning the war into a war against slavery, prevents Britain and France, really, from coming in on the side of the South. The Emancipation Proclamation has two motives. Do not listen to people who say it was purely a cynical, pragmatic move by Lincoln. He didn't care about slaves one way or another. Lincoln only wanted to keep Britain and France out. That's not true. It's true that the Emancipation Proclamation did help keep Britain and France out, but Lincoln was also motivated by the fact that he disliked slavery and thought it was evil. Both reasons are reasons for the proclamation. By 1865, millions of slaves had been freed on the military authority of the President of the United States. But for slavery to be constitutionally outlawed, it would take the 13th Amendment passed after Lincoln's death in 1865. And Amendment number 13, as you'll see when you look at Reconstruction, ends slavery forever in the United States. But blacks in the United States were doing a lot more than passively being freed by Union armies. They were joining those Union armies in massive numbers. And black soldiers played a large role in the Civil War. On the 17th of July, 1862, Congress passed 2 acts allowing the enlistment of black troops in the North. Now, black soldiers would serve in entirely black regiments. They were segregated away from white soldiers. They served all together but with white officers. Few blacks at any military training. The officers were white and they commanded all black regiments. The first actual units were formed after emancipation. In October of 1862, the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers saw their first military action. And black soldiers in the Civil War faced racism and faced discrimination and inequality, especially at the beginning and throughout the war. Many whites felt that blacks could not be good soldiers. They felt that they lacked courage and bravery. There was official discrimination as well. A common private in the Civil War Army, white, made $13 a month. Blacks were paid $10 a month. And this obvious unfairness was rectified in 1864 when a number of black regiments refused any pay at all until they were paid the equal rate to their white counterparts. And Congress, seeing this, went along. And by 1864, black soldiers and white soldiers are making the same amount of money. Black troops get promoted to non-commissioned officers, sergeants, corporals, things like that. Although the officers are white, black NCOs, non-commissioned officers, sergeants, and corporals are very common by the end of the war. The most widely known battle fought by African Americans was the assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, by the 54th Massachusetts Regiment on July the 18th, 1863. The 54th Massachusetts volunteered to assault this Confederate fort, led by their colonel, a man from Boston by the name of Shaw. And they stormed this fort and were driven back after terrible, close, violent, vicious hand-to-hand combat. The fort was later taken with their help, but their assault on this fort showed, obviously, that they were just as brave and just as, willing to fight as any white soldier in the North. And if you want to see a pretty decent movie about that, go see Glory, which is a pretty good movie about the 54th Massachusetts. Sometimes black soldiers were treated differently when they were captured by Confederates. That happened fairly often. The most famous example in 1864 at Fort Pillow. The Confederates attacked a Union fort held by about half white and half black soldiers. And although the evidence is not entirely clear, it does seem that the Confederates specifically aimed for the black soldiers, refused to let black soldiers surrender, and massacred them at Fort Pillow. There is certainly evidence pointing in that direction. It's not obvious, it's not entirely clear, but it would certainly make sense that the Confederates have been accused then and till today of purposely killing the black troops and refusing their attempts to surrender. And for black troops throughout the rest of the war, their battle cry became, "Remember Fort Pillow." Throughout the war, approximately 180,000 black Americans, comprising 163 units, served in the Union Army, and many others served in the Navy as well. Both free-born blacks from the North and escaped runaway freed slaves joined the fight. 25 of those 180,000 earned the Medal of Honor, and if you just look at the simple numbers, about 1 in 10 Union troops who served in the Civil War were black. Many of them, they served in combat roles, in support roles. They experienced the full gamut of the Civil War experience, and expected to be appreciated, rewarded, and thanked for their service after the war, and unfortunately that really didn't come true. But they served with distinction, with honor, and with glory, and in some cases with glory, 180,000 black troops in the Civil War. Believe it or not, there were also black Confederate troops. In January of 1864, several Confederate officers proposed using slaves as soldiers because the Union was using black troops. And they said, as an incentive, any slave who fought for the South would be freed after the war. At first, Confederate President Jeff Davis refused to consider the proposal and even said, "You're not even allowed to talk about this anymore." But by the fall of 1864, the fortunes of the South had been reduced to such a point where people started saying, look, the only way we can possibly win is to arm the slaves. So on the 13th of March, 1865, the Confederate Congress passed a law allowing for the arming of slaves with the promise of freedom after the war, and President Davis signed it. A few black companies were raised and trained and drilled, but the war ended before any of them could be used in battle. Many slaves fought for, or wished to fight, for their freedom, for their country, their homes, as well. The question of race in the United States, is obviously a question fraught with, danger and issues and a lot of historical baggage. And the Civil War is no different between Lincoln's view on race slavery, the ending of slavery, the political motivations behind the ending of slavery, simply add, to the complexity of that issue. But coming out of it, what you had by the end of 1865 was 4 million freed slaves, 180,000 blacks who served the Union Army, and were expecting to be treated with a degree of equality and respect afterwards.